These are some frequently asked questions regarding ballot arguments. So first, are ballot arguments provided for in California law? Yes, in the California Elections Code, there are numerous rules for ballot arguments for measures that are submitted to voters in statewide elections. Where are these provisions contained in California law? They're contained in Division 9, Chapter 1, Article 6. And Article 6 is titled Arguments Concerning Measures Submitted to Voters. And again, these provisions are found in the California Elections Code. What happens if arguments for or against a ballot measure are not submitted? Elections Code Section 9060 provides that the Secretary of State is required by a general press release to request voters to submit arguments. When does the Secretary of State have to send this notice to voters? Elections Code Section 9061 requires that press release by the Secretary of State to be mailed at least 120 days prior to the date of the election at which the measure is to be voted upon. What must be contained in this press release? Elections Code Section 9062 requires the press release from the Secretary of State to consist of an announcement that contains 1, a summary of the essential nature or purpose of the measure for or against which no argument has been prepared or filed. 2, a statement that the affirmative or negative arguments or both have not been filed. Or 3, an invitation to any voter or group of voters to submit and file with the Secretary of State within the time limit specified the arguments for or against the ballot measure regarding which affirmative or negative arguments have not yet been filed. Who writes their summary in that press release? Elections Code Section 9063 requires the summary of a measure that's given in the press release by the Secretary of State to be the official circulating title and summary that was previously prepared by the state's Attorney General. How long can voter arguments be? Their arguments cannot exceed 500 words in length. What must accompany the ballot argument provided by a voter? Well, Elections Code Section 9065 requires a ballot argument to contain the following provisions. 1, the name, business, or home address, and the telephone number of each person submitting the argument. Second, if the argument is submitted on behalf of an organization, then the name, business address, and telephone number of that organization, and at least 2 of its officers. 3, the name, business, or home address and telephone number of a contact person for each individual or organization submitting the argument. 4, if the argument is signed by anyone other than the proponent or legislative author, then the name and official title of that person or persons authorized to sign the argument. And 5, the signed statement is also required. What happens if more than 1 argument for or against a ballot measure is filed with the Secretary of State as a result of that press release? Then Elections Code Section 9067 requires that the Secretary of State is going to select one of the arguments for actual printing in the State Voter Information Guidebook. Is there any guidance for the Secretary of State to follow in selecting a ballot argument? Yes, the Secretary of State must give preference and priority in the following order. 1, in the case of a measure submitted by the legislature to members of the legislature. 2, in the case of an initiative or referendum measure, the proponent of the measure. 3, bona fide associations of citizens. And 4, individual voters. How many signatories are allowed for a ballot measure argument? Elections Code Section 9068 prohibits more than 3 signatures from appearing with an argument printed in the State Voter Information Guide. What does the Secretary of State do with the submitted ballot arguments? The Secretary of State, within 5 days of receipt of those arguments, is required to send copies of the arguments in favor of the proposition to the authors of the arguments against, and copies of the arguments against to the authors of the arguments in favor. And then what happens with the arguments submitted to the opposing side? The author or authors may prepare and submit rebuttal arguments not to exceed 250 words, or they may authorize in writing another person or persons to prepare and submit and sign those rebuttal arguments.